Well, hello there, and welcome to today's webinar on interview questions that commonly come up with interview questions when I'm coaching people. So we're going to cover off a few main questions that might throw you, and I want to be able to go through the information that you'd be familiar with out of the module bundles that you're all able to have access to as participants in Career 365. Again, I'm Greg Weiss. I'm the founder and director of Career 365 and the head coach, and I'm looking forward to spending some time with you today. Just in terms of technology, I just ask if you can just bear with me a little bit. Does get a little bit, I'm showing my age if I have some problems with it. But first off, let me just ask you if I can just get a hello, a thumbs up from you, or just a hello, just saying that you can hear me okay. If you can do that, please, just in the chat window. Great. Hi there, I can see Alvin there, Gail, Sarah, just if I can get some, just clarifying, so it's great. So let's assume everybody else can hear, coming in loud and clear, I'm hearing, so fantastic. Okay, let's just get into the presentation, and what I want to be able to do is I'm going to take you through a few things which will be about handling these questions that often come up. And the interview is a critical thing for everybody as a participant. Let me just make sure that you're clear about an interview, and that really is a place for you to be able to demonstrate your capability for the job, your fit, and the like. So what is it that I like to be able to make sure that you consider in the mind of the interviewer, and that is that as the interviewee or the applicant, the candidate for the job, I like to try and draw the analogy of Sherlock Holmes, and that is that the interviewer is trying to collect enough evidence that one, you can fit, and two, that you actually can do the job, or that you've got enough of the basis to do the job, and maybe even with a little bit of training. So an interview is your opportunity to shine well and to see whether in fact you are what they're looking for, but then the opportunity for you to be able to ask in your own mind and heart whether the opportunity is really one for you as well. So that's what an interview is all about. Often people feel that it's a one-way street where they are interviewing you. I'd like to encourage that you really get the confidence to be able to make it much more of a level playing field, and that is that from adult to adult, that you're actually having a good, meaningful conversation with each other. But the first parts clearly are going to be around you being able to determine that they are going to be able to determine whether you are a fit for them, as well as you have the right skills and techniques, the competencies to fit with them. And then to have the opportunities to be able to ask them about your own fit. So let's just go through this, and just I've got this slide here because, as you know, bundle 6 in our modules make it very easy for you to really understand step by step what it is that is going to allow you to interview brilliantly every time. And as you see here in module 1, it will be for you to interview brilliantly every time, and that there are steps for a best practice interview, and I'm going to go through that shortly. And then also some questions. We're going to go through that a little bit as well towards the back end of today. The topics 3 and modules 2 and 3 there that you can see, I'm not going to cover off in today's webinar. If you have any questions, just some housekeeping. If you do happen to have any questions, what I would like to do is to encourage that you keep those towards the end. We'll have plenty of time to be able to cover those off. But just in the chat window, if I can get you just to type those questions up, that'd be great. Okay, let's just go into this. And there are different models for the interview. And quite some years ago, I settled on the SEO model. And in the modules, what you'll learn is the SEO module. And so if we go back here, module 1, topic 1 will actually help cover that off. But what I want to make sure of that you're aware of what SEO is, and that is a mnemonic for situation, action, and outcome. And I want to repeat what we actually talk about in these modules, and that is that if an interview is like Sherlock Holmes, like a detective trying to collect evidence, then in an interview, the SEO is your opportunity for you to be able to help the interviewer collect that evidence about you. So what's the evidence they're going to be collecting about you? And that's typically about the job description against which you have applied. And there'll be responsibilities, a list of responsibilities, but there'll also be a list of competencies or selection criteria. And when I coach people through our program, I encourage you to think of 2 or 3 examples of how you can evidence that you satisfy the selection criteria. A drink, just allow me to have a bit of a drink. And that is that the selection criteria is, if I'm the recruiter, I've got a brief that a client's looking for. And that brief is all about saying, okay, based on the selection criteria, how do the candidates I'm presenting stack up with that? It's the same thing with somebody who's a talent acquisition manager for an employer. They've got selection criteria against which they're going to recruit you potentially in to fulfill a job. And so there'll be responsibilities, key performance indicators and the like, but say the responsibilities and the selection criteria. And the SEO model that is here is all about you being able to collect evidence, or the interviewer collecting evidence about you. So a situation, an action, and an outcome. How do we make sure that the situation is defined? Often a question might be around, give me an example when. And so what I'd like to encourage as a broad framework for give me an example when is for you to be able to come up with more recent examples of give me a time when something happened, and explain. And so it's a good idea for you to be able to say, well, only recently, or in the last 6 months, or in my most recent job, this situation happened. And what I'd like to encourage you to do also is to think through typically the problem that you have solved for the organization around the situation. I definitely do not encourage you to say the situation is this. So just in the front of your mind, have the SEO model in place, but don't go, well, this situation is this, the action is this, then the outcome is this. So describing the situation in a brief way, then it is about moving to the A. The A is the action, or what was done in order to resolve the situation or the problem that presented. And the A is typically breaking it up into little bite-sized pieces. Now, in the modules, I talk about weeing all over yourself, and we don't want you weeing all over yourself. And what I mean by that, in all seriousness, is that often I find in interview that many people will talk about, well, we did this, we did that, and the like. And I'm encouraging you to talk about your role. I did this in the context of a team. So the recruiter or the talent acquisition manager is hiring one person, you potentially. And so whilst you worked within a team, the best way of you being able to describe what you did is to talk about, I worked within a team that was responsible for X, Y, and Z. What I'd encourage you then to do would be talking about your role within that team. I did this, I did the other, and so on. I did other tasks and so on and so forth. So weing or youve yourself is really just making a mess of the interview, pun intended, and also not to be too backwards and coming forwards about your role specifically within a team. If it was you directly doing that, then great, just talk about that. But in the context of a team, definitely talk about your responsibilities as part of that. And then the O is the outcome. And I encourage you to be able to tie back the outcome to the initial question. So it may be, for example, that tell me a time when you had to manage multiple projects and prioritize those. You could come up with an S that's around that, then ideally most recently. Then we talk about the O, talking about those different projects and how you were able to prioritize those. And then the outcome is how you were able to deliver to those, either yourself in the context of a team, but then tying that all back to saying, and that's how we were able to, or I was able to, here, I'm saying we all over ourselves. That's how I was able to deliver multiple projects. So that just gives you a little bit of a recap on the SEO model. And any more deep dive, please go back into the modules. Let's now get into some of the questions that often candidates get asked at interview. And before we actually get into this, the first one, I want to go back to one important thing, the SEO model and what is the interview. SEO helps to evidence to you, evidence to the recruiter that you can do the job, you've got the skills. What about fit? The fit aspect is potentially about opinions. What do you think about our company? What do you think about the current work environment? What do you think about what are you feeling about the economy at the moment? It may be some small talk. None of this is SEO stuff. It's all about your opinion. And so there are two parts to the interview. One is, do you have the skills and competencies to do the job? And the other is this person actually likely to fit within the organization? And often it's around these other aspects, which could be about opinion and the like. So let's move on here about the first question, which is to do with tell me about yourself. That's one of the questions that might be right at the start of an interview. And what's that all about? Tell me about yourself. The problems I find that people get into in tell me about yourself is that they start a broad, irrelevant amount of information about themselves. So I would encourage you to narrow it down, to basically say along the lines of, I can tell you a lot about myself, but how about we narrow it down to me on a professional level? And you can talk about, well, got my degree in X years, worked through a number of businesses doing these sorts of things. And if the interviewer then asks you to be able to expand that out a little bit more, then what I'd suggest is that you might talk about some sports that you're interested in, where you like to go to holidays and so on and so forth. But broadly, keep it at a professional level. This is home-based. I can hear some tapping in the background. If it's annoying you, my apologies. This is real and it's working from home. Okay, another question is, what is your greatest strength? What's behind all that? It's an interesting one that often people again get unstuck with. And what is your greatest strength can end up being a little bit of a grey area. I would encourage, again, anytime you go for an interview, is to think about what it is that the recruiter or the talent acquisition manager is thinking about for the role. So you would have actually looked at the job description, you applied for a job, and I'd be looking at what your strengths are against the selection criteria of that particular job. So you're looking at the industry context. of the company or the organization you're applying for, what they are looking to achieve. You'd get a lot of that out of your background research, so on the web, some news and so on and so forth. And then what I'd be looking to do is to apply a strength that you've got in the context of the direction that the company's wanting to go, as well as what this job's all about. That's how I'd handle your greatest strength. Being humble and being competent, find balance. So the recruiter or the talent acquisition manager is looking to see, again, how you fit, what your competencies or your skills, knowledge, and aptitudes like, but it's also about how you handle that question. Related to this is about your greatest weakness. And without it sounding trite, what I'd encourage you here to do is to relate to something that can also be somewhat of a strength. For example, if you're part of if you've had experience in the past where you've, say, brainstormed and been part of a brainstorming meeting, and then you put your hand up to say, I'll be part of that project and that project, you might get really excited. You could actually say, for example, my biggest weakness is, in fact, I get very excited about the brainstorming, when I'm in a brainstorming session, then I volunteer maybe for a little bit too much. That could be a weakness, but it can also be something that shows that you're quite keen about getting into a job. Another aspect of weakness potentially could be around that you might take on a little too much. You might find that the job that you get a little bit bored if you're not busy enough. These are two-edged swords that you're able to talk to the interviewer about, and then they can more deeply dive into that. But if you start to talk about anything that's not really related to the job, I'd avoid doing any of that. Your greatest weakness can be a flip side to being, how can the organization harness you in the context of what the role's all about? So not being busy enough means create more busyness. Not working on getting a bit bored a little quickly might also be about the jobs aren't complex enough. Brainstorming and coming up with too much might mean then that you take on a little bit too much, maybe a little bit too much enthusiasm. These are all two-edged sword type answers to questions about what your greatest weakness is. The next one, what are your salary expectations? Is this a common question or what? And this is so tricky for people. What are your salary expectations? I recommend to people that, so what's that all about? It could be, and it depends when this is asked. It could be that you might present as a very experienced professional and that they're trying to work out whether they can afford you. But if your salary expectations, for example, just purely for example, are say $80,000, and the employer has an expectation in their head that it's $100,000, for example, then you're really doing yourself a disservice about discounting you by $20,000 if you disclose that. So I train people to ask, before you answer this question, is to gently ask the employer, what are your salary expectations for the role? Meaning, what's the range of salary that's on offer? And if they might say, well, it's between $80,000 to $100,000, then your next question is, on what basis do you remunerate people at $80,000 through to $100,000? You're then able to collect information, and then if your expectations are within that, you could say, I'm comfortable with that. Frankly, I was thinking probably towards, because I satisfy the criteria, closer to the $100,000 mark. That would be my expectations. So that's how I'd encourage you to go through what are your salary expectations. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? I saw a fantastic meme recently, which was, I think it was on Facebook, and it was to do with never in my wildest dreams, 5 years ago, what I've ever answered, what my plans are in 5 years' time to be working from home in isolation. And I think it's a really good meme. I really like that one. And so where do you see yourself in 5 years? What's behind that question? It's to do with where you see yourself in the context of this company in the next 5 years. Now, some pitfalls here. I definitely don't encourage you to say to the interviewer, in your job. I certainly don't encourage you to identify titles that you want. What I would encourage you to do is something differently, and that's to talk about what it is that you can give to the employer that you're hoping to be involved with. So what is it you can give? What is it that you might be able to learn as a result of being involved, and what you can contribute to the business? Avoid titles, but definitely talk about going down a track more deeply into the type of role that you're applying for, and then maybe also saying that depending on the opportunities, you have an interest in these other areas. What are those areas? And you might find that you're quite open to the idea of moving upwards or into different areas of the business. But definitely, the other way of saying it is it's very hard to work out where things are at in 5 years, but in the context of what the recruiter or the talent acquisition manager is wanting to understand from you do you understand the company's goals, where they're going, and how you can contribute towards those aims of the organization. Okay, number 6, tell me about a time you worked with a difficult person. Now, this is not, this could be one of those SEO type answers. You could come up with a situation around that, an action and an outcome. It also gives you the opportunity, and by the way, this actually applies to almost everything if you can settle into an interview well, and that is that you could actually ask them, what type of difficulties do you mean? Because a difficult person could be aggressive, assertive, could be bullying. It could be somebody who doesn't honor a work-life harmony equation, any of those things. So that question about working with a difficult person in itself is a little difficult until you define what difficult is. Once you reflect back what that difficult means, then you've got much more ability to be able to then come up potentially with a SEO that's specific around that. It also could be a bit of a red flag to you around what it means to work with difficult people. Is it the boss that you're going to be working with? Is it the team or otherwise? So important for you to be thinking about that. Do you have any questions for me is a bonus one. And I wanted to get into this and suggest that you have a look at my LinkedIn profile, and specifically, and they actually are also repeated in the modules. But let me just show you this one here, which was, and just pulling up the one. It says, can you see that there? And just so that you go into my LinkedIn profile and you get to see, goes quite some time back, from August 2014, or quite some time ago. And in here, we have a number of questions to ask the the interviewer about. For example, at commencement in this article, I say, I encourage you to probably get an idea how long you've got for an interview. For example, today I was coaching somebody who told me that their interview is only half an hour as an initial one. You want to find that out, because half an hour is not going to allow you to go through an enormous amount. Your expectations might be that you've got an hour at interview, and half an hour is a completely different ball game. So a good first question is, as you're settling in, is to ask the question, by the way, how long have you allocated for this interview? And then you might, before we get more deeply into question 7 here about do you have questions for me, is at the beginning of the interview, you may, as you're settling in, just say, look, do you think, based on the amount of time that we've got together, that there's an opportunity for me to ask some questions of you down the line? And so it creates a mutual adult to adult expectation that you do want to ask some questions, because you're trying to work out your fit with them, and whether they in fact have an opportunity that you like as well. It's not all about you being right for them, it's also about them being right for you. So having covered those 2 questions off, let's assume you go through the whole SAO process, and at the end come up with question 7, which is, do you have any questions for me? And in this article that I've suggested that you get to, there are some questions, but it's also in the modules. Why is the role vacant? How long's it been vacant? If it's a replacement for a previous incumbent, ask how long was the last person in the role? If that's less than 2 years, ask, and before that, how long was the previous person in that role? And what's that going to provide you? That's going to provide you an idea about stability, why these people moved on. Did they leave the organization? Did they get promoted up? It creates some sort of situation, an audit in your head around the dangers or the pluses of moving into that organization. A bit of an onboarding question would be, how would you describe the first 3 to 6 months in the role? What does good performance look like? How would you measure that performance? How would you describe your style of leadership or management? Whether it's the recruiters, you'd be asking then about the individual to whom you'd be reporting, or if you're being directly interviewed, you could find out about either your managers, if they're directly interviewing you, or from HR or whoever about that person. What's the team like? Is there anything further you'd like to ask me? How did you feel this interview went? Now, that's a really important question, because often people leave the interview with no real next steps. So the next thing is a question about what are the next steps in the interview process. So that article that I've shared with you from LinkedIn, this one here, if I can suggest that you go in there and follow the instructions, but have those questions written out. It could be a Zoom interview, it could be a Skype interview, or when everything lifts, it could be a face-to-face interview, but have them written out so that you can have structured questions to ask of your future employer. But those questions here about how did you feel this interview went, give some immediate feedback to you as the applicant. As I started to say, often when I'm getting a debrief from people that we're supporting, and I said, well, how did it go? And they say, I don't know. I said, well, what are the next steps? And they say, I don't know. It's not good enough. You've got to leave the scene of an interview understanding what it's like, how you performed, how you feel they performed for you, and importantly, what their impression is about you, so that you know what those next steps are. So trying to get some feedback could be also that you're the first person that they interviewed, and if they do have a few, you want to then get an idea about where you fit and how you satisfied their questions, because it also provides an opportunity for you to circle back and to be able to come make sure that before you leave that interview, that you've not left any stone unturned in terms of them collecting information about your fit and your competence to do that. And then that last question, what are the next steps in the interview process? You can get an idea about how you're moving forward, timing, the lie of the land, what the competition is like, and so on and so forth. And it can also help you understand when it's appropriate and through what mechanisms it's appropriate for you to circle back and ask for further progress. So it may be, for example, they might come back to you and say, well, we're interviewing 2 or 3 other people, and so we'll have an idea in the next week about who we want to progress with. Well, that's very helpful for you to then understand timing, and then you could actually ask, well, what's appropriate for me to be able to then circle back? If it's through a recruiter, it's through that recruiter. But if it's actually direct, then you can have a way in which you can come back to to your future employer and ask what those next steps are. So in terms of that, those are the main points that I'd be encouraging that people handle across those questions. Let's just recap. If we go back, we looked at going backwards. I'm going backwards in time here. We've actually had a number of different questions and about SEO. We've looked at, now let me just go back to this. We've looked at what the interview process is about. Let me just go back in here. We've talked about what the interview is all about. We've talked then about the modules. We've talked about the SEO model. We've also talked about Sherlock Holmes collecting evidence, and also about fit. And then what we've talked about is some questions. Tell me about yourself. What's behind that? What are your greatest strengths? What's behind that? What are your greatest weaknesses? What are you, what's behind that? What are your salary expectations? How to handle that? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? Tell me a time when you worked with a difficult person, and to get that qualification there. Do you have any questions for me? And I've referred you to that article that I posted a number of years ago in my LinkedIn, but it's also in your modules. And then a wrap up. So let me ask you, just in terms of this, because I know I've talked directly to you here, let's open it up for some questions if you've got. So just if you can type it into the chat window whilst I grab myself a little bit of a water. Okay, a question really would be around preparation for an interview. Hold on 1 second, sorry. Okay, question would be around preparation for interview. When you're applying for a job, the fact that you're going to be going into an interview is, it's hard enough. The reality is that it's hard enough. So showtime is when you're on. And that showtime is, in fact, the interview. So the most important things are initially around can you fit and can you do the job? I want to encourage that you spend as much time as you can in the pre-planning stages about looking at your the responsibilities of the job, and thinking through each of those bullet points of the responsibilities. How can I evidence to my future employer, either through the recruiter or directly to them, that I've got that experience? And so looking at each of those bullet points, thinking through scenarios, ideally the more recent than the further back, and showing that you can actually do that job based on those responsibilities. But much more importantly, if I were a recruiter and I were handling a recruitment assignment for the employer, then I'd be saying, I'd be looking at the selection criteria. I'd be making sure that each and every one of those selection criteria were a big tick mark. Now, some of the selection criteria might be tertiary qualifications. Well, that's just facts. but you might actually have proven experience project managing multiple projects to deadlines. That's where you want to actually come up with 2 to 3 different examples specifically around those selection criteria. Those selection criteria mean that you're going to be then evaluated potentially against other candidates, just to be able to confirm that you are that you can do it. And then the recruiter or the talent acquisition manager is going to compare you against maybe others. And you want to be very, very precise. So it all comes down to practice making perfect beforehand. So in answer to your question, the question is around how can you prepare? And the answer is really going through the job description, looking at the responsibilities, and really importantly, the selection criteria, and coming up with 2 to 3 different SEOs around that. Okay. All right. I've been asked about circling back to the salary question. Yeah, this is a big one. And I want to just make sure that you're very clear about this. Okay. If you are asked ahead of time what your salary expectations are, again, it's around, can they afford you? And are you within the range? There's if you can ask questions before you divulge, then it's a little wiser. So Stephen Covey talks about seek to understand before you're understood. Dale Carnegie says in How to Win Friends and Influence People, use your ear. You've got 2 ears and 1 mouth. Use them in that proportion. So asking questions is important. So in the context of the salary question, before you actually say, well, I'm looking for X, I want to emphasize and I've helped hundreds of people like this, and they've thanked me for this, and that is ask the question first what the range is. If you don't know what the range is, you've got to ask. If you do know what the range is, and sometimes it's in the advertisement from X to X, from X to Y, you want to then make sure that you're understanding on what basis it's X through to on what basis it's Y. And then you can collect that information about on what basis they're awarding the range. If you're comfortable, then you can say, well, it sounds to me as if my experience is at the lower end, or the like, but or towards the higher end. But at least what you're not doing is that you're not immediately sticking a stake in the ground about what it is. And imagine, again, it's what I shared earlier in the webinar. Imagine if you'd said, for example, $60,000 when the range is 80 to 100. It's going to take you for a long, long time and a lot of effort to make up that $20,000 that you may have been able to grab, so to speak, that was on the table if you'd actually asked a better question. Okay, another question I've got is, are there other questions that typically get people unstuck? And the answer is yes. And I'd say that that's going to be the topic of another webinar, if you'd like that to happen. So I wouldn't mind some feedback there. Okay, any other questions? No? Okay, great. So let's just again repeat. What we've done is, I just want to make sure that, that I leave here with you knowing enough here, and that is that the interview is for you to be able to show that you fit and that you can do the job. So fitting is around them feeling comfortable with you. So it's about your interpersonal skills and about fitting in, early stage rapport building at the start of the interview. Then it's about the interviewer wanting to become like a Sherlock Holmes, a detective, collecting enough information about you every evidence about you. And that's to do with your SAOs. So practice those SAOs, the situation, action, outcome. You don't say, this is the situation, this is the action, this is the outcome. You're going through SAOs in the front of your mind. There's the model, but you're going through and reflecting on describing the situation to people, not using the word situation, describing what you did in the context of your team or you yourself, remembering about not weeing all over yourself, but it's about you mentioning about your role. I did this, I did that in the context of the team. And then the O is the outcome as an answers what the initial question was. Ties that all back. Again, if the recruiter or the talent acquisition manager wants to find out any more information, they can always more deeply dive into your answer. Then we talked about the modules and a framework in those modules for you to go through. And today's webinar was about the first couple of pieces of those modules, but then there are some other ways of creating a very good impression at interview, which we didn't cover off in today. Then what we did was we moved into a number of questions that typically get people unstuck, and we went through those 6, and then I gave you a bonus one there, the 7th. And then we had the Q&A. So hopefully you've learned a fair bit today. I would like to get your feedback. A last question. What if you don't strictly meet the selection criteria, but you know you could do the job? What an excellent question. Thanks for that. That's a really good question. What if you don't strictly meet the selection criteria, but you know you could do the job? Well, it's more common that people don't strictly meet the criteria, particularly if an organization, let's draw the analogy, an organization may be looking for a circle and you're the oval. Or it could be that they've got a size circle and you're bigger or you're smaller than that. Often, often organizations will not find the exact fit. A square peg in a round hole doesn't work, but a close shape to that role would certainly be more likely to help you get up. So in answer to the question, what if you don't strictly meet the selection criteria, but you know you could do the job, is around asking, and particularly at the back end of the interview, how did it go? If it's clear that there's a little bit of a question mark, if you get the opportunity to ask the interviewer if there's anything that you could have answered better, or getting some feedback, you could then let them know that, one, you're keen on the job, and that you recognize that there might be 1 or 2 edges there that you don't have, and you'd be prepared, one, to invest in yourself to be able to get that skill up or to improve that. But the other one might be that if you can learn that if the culture of the organization is such that they'll invest in you, then that might be another way of being able to sell yourself into that particular job. Organizations typically will buy in somebody, will hire in someone based on attitude and then train them up. You, on the other hand, and typically what will happen is that most people leave an organization not because of the majority of the time people leave because of a fit issue. Most often it's to do with their leader. So getting into an organization is around fit. It's also around the opportunity to to find out if you could be trained up, if there's a slight gap role. And that's actually, that's how I would answer that question. So thanks for asking that. Okay. In fact, that actually might be something that might be a very good input into another webinar if you'd like to actually do that, if you'd like us to cover that off. All right, so that's where I'm going to leave it for today. I want to thank you for your time and for your involvement. I'd be very happy to have you reach out to me through email. Let's do that. Or importantly, through the Career 365 LinkedIn participant support community. If you're not a member already, please get into that. Invitation only, but it's an opportunity for you to be able to interact with me, other members of the team, other people who are going through the same process of finding their next career move. Okay, nice spending time with you. Wish you well. Good luck with your interviewing.